markup from live performances to do the process another way?
Those are great questions. Can I be heard? Those are great questions. The honest answer to the first one is I did all of the markups, and I had hoped to do this a little bit more broadly at one point, and somehow my energies went elsewhere, and I never did. You brought up a subject that I think is really interesting, though, in the other part of the question of trying to infer these from performances. This is a very tricky thing to do. I mean, from performances, what one might see in an obvious way is changes in observable parameters, when things are played, how loudly they're played, whether or not vibrato is employed. But I guess my idea is that there is an interpretation that happens on a higher level than that, and these decisions about what happens with the sound are consequences of that. And I don't see any way to measure that directly. I think you have to ask a person for it.
Right, this lady in front here.
Thank you. My question is actually related also for Professor Raphael, probably also for Professor Lanskey. When you did your method for creating the prosody, did you inspire yourself at all from linguistic prosody? Because that is a term usually used in linguistics. And also part of my question is, you say the interpretation, there's no wrong or right interpretation, yet when you did a random generation of the prosody, everybody hated it. So there probably is some kind of form that is in a way wrong, and prosody in language does follow certain patterns and certain rules. And one more part to my question would be a follow-up to that, would be have you taken into account the nationalities of the native language of the people rating the how expressive the music sounded to them, and perhaps whether the pattern that you applied matched their native language in the prosody used? Because I'm assuming you went with although you say there's no way to measure it, probably in some way followed the rules of the English language, which are more or less strict, but do exist.
Gee, all sorts of interesting things that you bring up there. I think that I just use the term prosody loosely. People talk about, of course, prosody in poetry and prosody in language is in a way that I think is really analogous to important notions in music, the words that we choose to emphasize. This is a fundamental musical construct that I just tried to illustrate there. And of course, this is a very narrow part of interpretation, an important one. There are other dimensions. There's no claim that I'm capturing the whole thing. I didn't mean to say that there are not wrong interpretations. Did I say that? I think I should play some of the random ones for you, and one can look at the ideas that are expressed symbolically. And, well, I suppose what I mean when I say they're wrong is I think statistically we would find a large percentage of even somewhat musically educated enough to understand what the discussion is about reject them. I do think that there is a notion of correctness here. And as a matter of fact, in looking at something as hard to understand as interpretation, I think there are many different aspects to it, and there's some which are about beauty and very personal things, and things that are very hard to be objective about, and people may differ greatly on. And there's also a core of things that are about just conveying very basic notions that we would all agree on. And I think there is a notion of correctness there that I do believe in.
Are we allowed to respond, or do we have to do it?
Go ahead.
Because in my experience, so getting into rights and wrongs is very problematic territory. I'm sure we would all agree. But in my experience, if you play something and there's seemingly universal agreement that it's right or correct, whatever you want to say, there will always be somebody in the room that says, I hate that, it's wrong, and they have a good reason for saying it. Or the flip side, you may all say, oh, I hate this. I mean, the interesting example here is the Goldberg openings. So you hear the Rosalind Chirk and you say, oh my God, will this ever end? And yet you'd have to listen to the whole piece and it probably adds up to something. You may not like it, but you may understand it and find it interesting and so forth. So I suspect we would all agree with that, even though you've quite rightly said about statistical extent, and more people might agree on one thing than not. Then you would have to look at issues of nationality and provenance and so forth. Sorry.
That one was too slow.
Yes, it was, I agree.
There's also that sense that actually if we go by what people like, they probably will like the familiar. But actually, Gould was remarkable insofar as he threw possibilities that people hadn't heard before. So the possibility of some way of generating a new way of hearing it that may not be initially comfortable actually does seem to me to be a genuine potential here, that actually you can play with the variables in ways that allow us to hear it as we've never heard it before, which might translate into a new sort of aesthetic preferences.
There's a question there.
Yeah, it's a small point, but I feel it needs to be said. The random interpretation is not an interpretation. There's nobody interpreting it that way, right? It becomes an interpretation if somebody says, I think this is the interpretation. But it's difficult to imagine any such person doing that. But if they were to do that in all good faith, it would be an interpretation and it would have some rightness for them.
Good point.
One last question here. I think we just have time for just one last question.
Yeah, I think the idea of the multiplicity of interpretations is something that we've grown accustomed to, and it's fascinating to see the range of them. But John, Rink here, you're talking about really multiplicity of versions of Chopin's works. And I wonder if you can comment at all on the distinction between, well, I think of popular music with various versions and covers of pieces and things like this. Part of it's performative, but part of it, if it's its own group, is variants on the thing. So just comment on Chopin, your experience with Chopin and the variant versions of a piece, and what's one to do with those?
Well, first of all, the fact that for many Chopin pieces there are so many different versions is a useful reminder that music does not exist in one and only one form. And then when we bring performance into the mix, it becomes even more complex. In terms of what the performer might do, I would say repeat performances. I mean, give more and more performances of different versions. I think the most interesting thing in many cases is to give performances with explanation. I think this is what lies behind the Goldberg paper and performance that we'll hear. I mean, you were saying that it's rare to have the opportunity to hear what lies behind performances, and we've now had that, and I think that's precisely the sort of thing that we should do more of. I call these opportunities talk and play events. Lecture recital would be one example of that, but in the case of Chopin, well, why not give a lecture recital and play 4 or 5 different versions of a piece, one after the other, and explain or allow people just to hear?
I completely agree. I think one of the other things that's really fascinating is to move from the talk and play where the expert talks and then the expert plays to a context where you talk about establishing shared positions of vulnerability so that everyone can have a freer listening experience potentially as well as a performative experience. And playing with this concept of the shape of the event is one of the things that can unfold out of, for example, having different versions of the same piece. The way in which it evolves, it offers opportunity for freedom, which we may not have found otherwise.
Well, it brings us back to that issue of right or wrong or good or bad or whatever it is, because you then get into the realm of, well, what is interesting about it? Why do you hear what you hear the way you hear it? And that opens it up hugely and I think very enrichingly.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's happened with recordings, for example, is, and this is one of the interesting things that Stephen didn't mention, which was one of the drivers for actually doing an arrangement for 2 pianos, is it's incredibly virtuosic to play it on one. But there's a real question, did Bach ever really mean it to be a virtuoso warhorse? And probably not. So actually to go back and just explore the music and take that dimension of it out becomes a really fascinating experience. I'm not saying it's easy to play this way, and he did put some other bits in, but one of the things that's really interesting, I expect this evening, is by knowing that some of the notes are not by Bach, yet that some of the variations hold exclusively only notes by Bach. We're working together that we think more freely about the authentic variations than the variations on variations, because you unpack all sorts of opportunities in one particular performance, which goes back again to the concept of different versions of the same piece. You begin to see different things, multiple layers, different dimensions, new dimensions. And that's... Yeah.
Right. Before we end the session, just one more reminder for all the speakers of this workshop to meet outside the concert hall for a quick photo-taking session. Now let us put our hands again to thank John, Christopher, Bernard, and Stephen for a very exciting session. Thank you.